Faster Mai, good evening, and welcome to this week's episode of Agenda. I'm Ewan Gorn. On the programme today, a finance watchdog has labelled the Isle of Man one of the top 20 most aggressive tax havens, but the Chief Minister has dismissed the findings as irrelevant in an international context. We hear from both Howard Quayle and the Tax Justice Network for both sides of this issue, which continues to re-emerge. Well, as we heard, a finance watchdog has questioned what real economic benefits the island's tax policies provide for the Manx people. Alex Cobham is the chief executive of the Tax Justice Network. He made the comment after his organisation placed the Isle of Man 17th on a list of 64 jurisdictions which it claims are the most aggressive tax havens. The Chief Minister has dismissed the index as irrelevant and says the island is fully compliant with the latest international standards set by bodies such as the OECD. He's defended the Isle of Man's record in this area, citing leadership on tackling issues like base erosion profit shifting. Well, let's have a look at the list. The Corporate Tax Haven Index, it's called, ranks 64 different jurisdictions by their importance to multinational corporations and by how much they erode the tax revenues of other countries around the world. That's determined by measuring how far each government allows big businesses to avoid paying tax in other areas. Top three are British Virgin Islands, Bermuda and the Cayman Islands, with the Isle of Man's fellow Crown dependencies, Jersey and Guernsey, ranked in 7th and 15th place respectively. The United Kingdom also in 13th, so the Isle of Man scoring in under all those neighbouring countries. As I mentioned, the Chief Minister gave short shrift to the list. He spoke to Alex Watton.
This rating is irrelevant. Basically, it's not an international organisation. We care about organisations that matter on a global stage, such as the OECD. And if you look at the OECD, the Isle of Man has been through two assessments, two rounds of their global forum on tax transparency, and we're one of only 5 jurisdictions to be fully compliant each round. And I think we're only one of 8 to be fully compliant just for the second round itself. So that to me is the rating that matters. Also, Moneyval is another organisation that we respect and comply with. This is not an internationally acknowledged group. They just do their own thing. And so, as I say, it really is an irrelevance. But what's disappointing is that even if you did accept it, I know I was listening to your report on the news when you read with the story in the morning. You didn't point out there that the UK has a worse rating than the Isle of Man. And, so even if anyone put any credibility to this rating, the Isle of Man has a better rating than the United Kingdom.
I suppose in some regards, though, people want to know what it's like in comparison to places that are very similar to the Isle of Man, such as Jersey and Guernsey, which we, of course, have talked about. Guernsey, as well as yourself, saying that this lacks credibility. On the other hand, though, Jersey says that they are fully compliant and they've just come with a sort of statement that they're doing everything they can.
Well, that's fine. I mean, obviously, Guernsey agree with ourselves that it's an irrelevance, this organisation. It's the OECD. They are the ones that matter, and they have the international reputation. They are internationally recognised, and we've signed up as a jurisdiction in the early 2000s. I think it was 2001. Tynwald passed an agreement that it would comply with OECD rules and regulations, and that's something my administration has honoured.
Well, if we think back to the Paradise Papers panorama, is this another way that the island feels attacked on its tax laws?
Well, they obviously have their views, and if they were the recognised panel, then I might have more respect for them. But the Isle of Man complies with its international standards, and that is the marker that we go for. And that's the key element which is recognised by all jurisdictions around the world.
What perhaps this throws up, aside from things we've had in the past, is the moral implications. Not that we're breaking any laws or doing anything illegal, but in fact we have a moral obligation to have more stringent laws in place. What about that?
Well, we comply with international standards. Now, as I said before, even if you paid any attention to this rating. The Isle of Man has better standards than the United Kingdom, according to them. So those in the United Kingdom that criticise us, would have to get their house in order before they criticised us. But as I say, we do see this as totally irrelevant, that we give no standing to whatsoever.
I mean, you have said in your statement as well that we received the morning after this news came out that you're closely tracking changes to international standard. Does that mean you're just keeping an eye on things as and when they happen, or because you also say you're a global leader? So what are we trying to do?
Well, when we see breaking developments on taxation law, for example, base erosion, profit shifting, that was something that the OECD had been discussing and they'd been thinking of bringing forward, and I attended meetings in Paris to discuss that very topic. And the Isle of Man was only the second country in the world, behind Austria, to ratify it and to sign up to base erosion, profit shifting. So that's where you stop companies moving around the profits of their companies into various other companies to try and avoid tax. And the Isle of Man was the second country in the world to sign up to that. So I think that clearly shows that the Isle of Man doesn't just follow the others, that we do lead in certain areas, and we are committed that the Isle of Man is not a place for people to come or send their companies to avoid paying tax in their own jurisdiction where the profits have been earned.
Chief Minister Howard Quayle. So what are the other Crown dependencies? How have they reacted to this index? Well, speaking to BBC Jersey, a spokesperson for the government there said they were fully compliant with standards set by independent global bodies. Guernsey, on the other hand, said the index lacks credibility, adding their governance is part of the solution in the fight against financial crime. You're listening to Agenda on Manx Radio. On the second half of the programme, we're going to be speaking to Alex Cobham. He's the Chief Executive of the Tax Justice Network, the group that compiled, as we heard, the corporate tax haven list, which places the Isle of Man in 17th place. I asked him to explain how the list was compiled and why.
We publish the Financial Secrecy Index every 2 years since 2009. And that's really focused on the degree of financial transparency, things like the automatic exchange of information about bank accounts, or the public registers of beneficial ownership of companies, trusts and foundations and so on. This, the Corporate Tax Haven Index, is a complementary index that's focused very much more on how aggressively jurisdictions attempt to attract profit shifting by multinationals. So it's really very much focused on the problem of avoidance, which we estimate causes global revenue losses of about $500 billion each year. So what we're looking at is the 64 jurisdictions assessed according to a combination of how aggressively they position themselves to try and attract profit shifting, and then how big a player they are globally. So we're not picking on the smallest players, even where they're very aggressive, if they're actually unsuccessful. Equally, if you're a very big player, not quite as aggressive, we think you actually bear more responsibility for the global problem if you're seeing a bigger share of foreign direct investment flows. So it's a combination.
So what are the indicators you look at when assessing how aggressive a country's tax laws are?
So we've put together 20 indicators, drawing largely on the available data from international organisations, some original research, and of course all of this is publicly available on the website, which I should say is corporatetaxhavenindex.org. But those 20 indicators are really in 5 categories. So one is the lowest available corporate income tax rate that you can get in that jurisdiction, which is typically much lower than the headline statutory rate. Another is the loopholes and gaps, the kind of exclusions and exemptions that are available to get out of paying the statutory rate. The third one is transparency, and that still matters here. Another one, the fourth one, is anti-avoidance measures. So where jurisdictions are trying to stop tax dodging by multinationals and they have these anti-avoidance measures in place, typically that means they're not looking to attract avoidance from other places. And then finally, a category around the aggressiveness of a jurisdiction's double tax treaties. Basically, how hard have they pushed other countries to allow them to reduce the tax, the withholding tax that might be paid on an entity operating in both places. So overall, it gives you this sense of just how aggressive, as a score out of 100, where 100 is the most aggressive you can be, how aggressive the jurisdiction is being in terms of trying to attract profit shifting.
And as a research group, how much digging do you have to do to sort of work out the true facts behind these indicators? Because often some of these sort of tax regimes can be quite complex. They can be sort of well hidden or well sort of buried in some senses. So I'm sure the public aren't aware of some of these figures. So how did you sort of go about your work there?
That's a really good point. And this is the biggest research exercise we've done. In fact, it's the biggest team we have working is on this index. That's partly supported by research funding we have from the European Commission in the COFAS project. What we've done is basically look through the tax law and some of the regulatory framework for each of these jurisdictions. And that involves, along the way, effectively constructing approaches to assess the relative aggressiveness in each of these areas. Now, often we're drawing on, as I say, on international organisations like the International Bureau of Fiscal Documentation so that we can get consistent data points. But in some areas, we've had to really go back to the law itself and take out the relevant pieces. So it has been a big research exercise. As I say, that's all available. So in a sense, if people think, do you know what, I don't really think that double tax treaties are a big part of this, then they can go and look at the other indicators and people can reconstruct an index that they would prefer if they think, some of these things aren't so important, for example. So all of that data is there. We're hoping not just to kind of put out this index, this one-time ranking, and in fact we'll do this every 2 years from now, but also to make available a new set of data for researchers, for academics, and indeed for tax officials who are seeking to stop avoidance. Is
there a measure of prediction involved in calculating this list? I'm just talking about things like the potential profit shifting in the jurisdiction, the magnitude. Mentioned the corporate investment activity as a proxy for that. So is there an element of sort of guesswork as to what's actually going on?
So it's funny, when we began looking at this and thinking about it, we, obviously there's a lot of expertise in the network and we talked to a great many external experts of different sorts. One thing we considered doing was using the existing estimates of profit shifting in order to construct what would effectively have been estimates of the revenue losses or the scale of profit shifting that each jurisdiction is responsible for. Now, in the end, we felt that none of those estimates yet are sufficiently robust that we'd really want to pin the whole index on that. I think we're getting there. There's been a lot more research in that in the last few years, and it's starting to form a consensus of the rough scale, but it doesn't yet feel good enough to do jurisdiction level justice. So what we've done instead is we're really combining these very robust and objectively verifiable measures of aggressiveness in different areas with a measure of scale, so how much foreign direct investment is going through, in order to get a sense not of the actual revenue losses or the actual scale of profit shifting, but the comparative risk that each jurisdiction poses globally. So how aggressive you are and how much investment is going through your jurisdiction gives a sense of the potential of the jurisdiction to cause tax avoidance, to cause revenue losses elsewhere. Now, you could argue about how those things are combined, and again, that's open to people to, if they want to rework in different ways, they can. But we think it's pretty robust and it's completely transparent, at least. So the ranking is fairly clear about where the biggest risks being imposed on the rest of the world are.
What do the Tax Justice Network hope to achieve from publishing this list and ranking these jurisdictions in this way?
So what we found with the Financial Secrecy Index, as that's built up since 2009, is that we very often get both a good media focus on the particular problems as they exist at global level when we publish this, but also in individual jurisdictions, especially those ones that are the most intense parts of the problem. You often find that you get a political and a media debate that really starts to put some scrutiny on the policies in question. So in this case, I understand that you'll be talking to the Chief Minister in the Isle of Man. That's exactly the kind of reaction in the sense you want people to say, not, are we the bad guys, as it were, but to engage in a policy discussion about whether everything that the Isle of Man is doing, and a Haven score of 100 out of 100 means the Isle of Man is as aggressive as it's possible to be, according to our methodology, whether that's really having any benefits for the Isle of Man, given that, as I say, it's very likely to be causing revenue losses for other countries. So what's the discussion in the Isle of Man among politicians about any kind of trade-off there, if there is a trade-off? And in fact, it may well be the case that this very aggressive position, apart from damaging the reputation of the Isle of Man and causing revenue losses elsewhere, may not actually be doing the Isle of Man or the people of the Isle of Man any good either. So actually there may well be a kind of win-win argument to make the Isle of Man's laws less aggressive in terms of trying to attract profit shifting, potentially giving rise to a more progressive tax system on the island, and reducing the damage that's being done elsewhere.
Well, I can give you our Chief Minister's initial response. It was actually to question the relevance of your list and the credibility of your organisation. He says groups like the OECD and Moneyval, which have assessed the Isle of Man and assessed them as fully tax transparent and compliant, have given them the okay. So why should the public listen to the Tax Justice Network?
So, this is an argument that we heard with the Financial Secrecy Index at the beginning. People would tell us that, their jurisdiction was ranked as compliant or something by the OECD or by the International Monetary Fund or whoever. What you'll find is that those international organisations are always behind the curve. So, when we set out policy positions in the early 2000s, they were written off by people at the OECD as utopian and unrealistic. But by about 2013, all of the things we'd set out 10 years earlier had become the global policy agenda. In the same way, what we're doing in the Corporate Tax Haven Index is assessing jurisdictions against what have emerged as effectively the standards for behaviour. So the Isle of Man's Chief Minister can say today, the OECD says we're fine, but the OECD is announcing a 1.5-year work programme that will lead to a radical reform of the international tax rules, moving very much towards this idea that the profits of multinationals should be declared in the same places where the real economic activity takes place. In other words, putting a line through a great deal of the current profit shifting, which the Isle of Man, among others, is trying to benefit from. What the index does is it assesses a jurisdiction effectively against whether or not it is trying to obtain profits that are not aligned with its own share of real economic activity. And that, in effect, is what the OECD process now is going to move towards, saying that this is unacceptable behaviour, and the international tax rules are going to move to reflect that. So, you can ignore us today, that's fine, but in a couple of years you'll find the OECD is saying what we're saying now. The choice for the Chief Minister and others is to say, does the Isle of Man want to be one of those jurisdictions that holds on by its fingernails to the old way until it becomes absolutely impossible to keep doing this kind of antisocial behaviour, or to see which way the wind is blowing and actually start taking some positive steps now to clean up the island?
I mean, it's just an example, but he would argue that on base erosion and profit shifting, I think the island was the second jurisdiction to sign up to the OECD's latest requirements on that a few years ago. Is that not showing leadership, being one of the first jurisdictions to do that?
So, I mean, here's the thing. We often see with the smaller jurisdictions, including the Crown dependencies and a lot of the UK's overseas territories, there is an injustice that is faced in the sense that the laws get made by the OECD, and then there's not much choice for a jurisdiction like the Isle of Man about signing up to them. And that's something that we've kind of tried to challenge, and this index and the Financial Secrecy Index both try to make sure that there's a level playing field. We're not picking out the small jurisdictions. That's why the United States and Switzerland, for example, are at the top of the Financial Secrecy Index, and you see the Netherlands and Luxembourg, say, very high up in the Corporate Tax Haven Index. But it's also true that when the Isle of Man signs up to the BEPS process, it really has no choice. And it's had no influence, but it also has no choice. And the fact that the OECD has today kicked off a new process is a reflection of how badly the BEPS process, that only finished in 2015, is seen to have failed. That was supposed to be the last word in fixing the international tax rules. In fact, it's become clear that it really didn't scratch the surface. So,
but doesn't that always happen with international tax rules? You sort of have new standards coming out all the time, and it's sort of a race to keep just ahead of them.
So that's more the case in terms of tax transparency. On the tax rules, the BEPS process was really the first major reform for several decades. The process that the OECD is starting today looks likely to be the biggest reform literally since the 1930s, when the League of Nations kind of put the basis of those rules in place. So no, it's not the case that there's in the tax rules that there is this continuing updating. What I think we're seeing now is a recognition that the explosion of profit shifting over the last couple of decades is out of control and is unacceptable, that it's costing high-income countries and developing countries far too much. So I think the business model of being these very aggressive jurisdictions competing to attract profit shifting, I think that's on the way out. And as I say, there's a choice for the Isle of Man and a few others to think about whether they want to really hang on to that as long as they can, despite the damage it does, or to say, no, now is the time, the wind is blowing a different way and we need to get ahead of this.
There is an argument out there to suggest that without our tax status, there would be not as many businesses here, there wouldn't be as many jobs available, we wouldn't be able to compete in the way that the island does. What do you say to that? There is an economic cost here, and our politicians seem to agree that it is worth it, despite the moral argument that you set out.
I mean, that's an interesting question, isn't it? So, on the one hand, if you'd say, look, there's a benefit to the Isle of Man from acting in this way, and it's big enough, in a sense, to not care about the damage being done elsewhere, there might be a case for example, for the UK, which obviously has been instrumental over decades in encouraging the Isle of Man down this road, for the UK to say, do you know what, it would be better for us, for the world, for us to effectively provide some medium-term funding stream to the Isle of Man in order for it to stop doing these things that have such big revenue costs elsewhere. And that's something for the UK government really to think about in relation to the whole range of overseas territories and crown dependencies, and there's clearly a UK responsibility for this. But I think for the Isle of Man policymakers and public today, I think there's also a question about whether this type of business actually has the benefits that you might hope. We've seen over a couple of decades the crown dependencies, including Jersey and Guernsey, have some of the highest per capita income levels in the world, while at the same time you have things like relatively widespread use of food banks. So you have a degree of inequality, a failure to capture those apparent benefits for ordinary people that's quite striking. And I think also a hollowing out of the economy. So a lot of the real activity, whether that's agriculture or tourism, for example, really fading into the background because finance pushes everything out. And that's not necessarily healthy either for the economy or for the society. And I suspect there is, a possibility of a win-win where dampening down the kind of the extremity of the model of pursuing that type of dirty finance or profit shifting might well come with benefits, not just for the rest of the world, but actually for Isle of Man society too.
But isn't it a question, I suppose, of who jumps first? Doesn't everyone have to jump together, I suppose? Because the argument, if we don't offer it, somewhere else will, and all the businesses that are here and do provide some jobs here, because there are some, will all uproot and leave, and we'll be worse off for it.
So I think where businesses are kind of fly by night and can really literally at the drop of a hat move to a different jurisdiction, these are not businesses that have serious roots in the economy, in the society. They're not employing serious numbers of people. It's really paper profits that are being booked. So the loss of that kind of business is relatively unimportant. It may affect the GDP figures, but it won't do much for people's employment or their ability to have a decent standard of living. And so I think looking at the more rooted businesses, the sort of more genuine activity that's in the island, I think you're going to find that actually that's quite sticky. It's there are real people living and working there.
Aren't some of those attached to the extra that comes with being 0% corporation tax, etc., like law firms, for example, other things like that supplement that industry?
So I think to an extent, yes, you would see if the Isle of Man was to say, look, our Haven score is 100 out of 100, let's see if we can get to say 60 over the next 2 years, and become something more kind of mainstream in our aggressiveness. I think you would see law firms and accounting firms and some of the banking shrinking, not disappearing, but shrinking. But at the same time, you'd expect to see some recovery of the real economy, the type of thing that's been pushed out over the years by that. What the evidence shows is that there is a finance curse. When you're completely dominated by one sector in this way, typically you have higher inequality, you have weaker governance, a higher chance of corruption, and you don't have those benefits being widely shared. So even if this shift actually saw lower economic growth for a period, it's almost certain that growth would be more widely shared, and the people of the Isle of Man might well end up better off even as that's happening.
The Tax Justice Network, can I just ask, how is the group funded?
So look, people can go to taxjustice.net and find all of this information. But our main funding comes from a combination of foundations that are focused on financial transparency and accountability. For example, the Ford Foundation from the United States, and some bilateral donors, for example, the Norwegian government, which is very focused on a higher degree of financial transparency and the benefits that can bring to developing countries in particular. As I say, our accounts and all of our funders, over £1,000, are listed on the website.
That's all from tonight's programme. We'll be back with more from Agenda next week, and you can listen to this episode as a podcast online. But for now, Guramayu and have a good evening.